and make me a co-host.
Yep, I did make you a co-host. Is it not popping in?
Okay. Yeah, I don't know that I've got any tools right now.
Really? Well, let me try again. I'll withdraw it and then do it again. Oops.
Can you restart the recording?
It is.
Okay, I think, let's see.
Try that. See if it pops up.
Okay. Let's go to more and see if more will give me, oh, no, that's participant list. And I'm looking for my share
screen, yeah.
Share screen guy.
It's saying you're a co-host.
Okay, well, I should be able to, so I just got to be able to turn. I'm going to go ahead and open the PowerPoint. We got that going. Let me just, let's see here. I'm going to go to full screen. There we go. There we go. Okay, well, good afternoon for most of us and a good morning for a few of us. Again, it's my pleasure to be part of this program. And I hope that we can make this particular program a little bit more interactive. If there are questions that happen during the presentation, I'm happy to address those as we can. We have 75 minutes, so we kind of have to keep within the time frame that's been established. But I want to make sure that I don't run past things that you need more information about. So definitely, if you need to raise your hand or whatever what works for you to let us know you'd like to explore something a little bit further. I think there's time within the presentation that I've organized to do so. Today's presentation really is designed to build on last time's. We looked at successful campaigns last time and some of the key things that you'll want to be thinking about. This is getting ready for going out and raising money. And I know that some of you are right there and ready to go out and raise some dollars for your project. And what I'm going to ask you to do is be patient. The Lakota would say, "Wowachin tonka." We need a little patience here because part of what I've learned is that if you spend time doing these preliminary steps, it will make the chances of being successful with your campaign that much better. And what I get, as a consultant, is people come there and say, "Well, yeah, all that stuff you're talking about, that's just consultant speak. You're trying to engage us to do your consulting work, and those things are not that important. We just want to get out there and raise some money. So we'll have a special event, we'll raise some money, we'll get started, and that'll be it." And what normally happens in that case is, yeah, they might raise a little bit of money, and then they come back and say, "We need some help. We've raised all the money we can, and it's not enough to build the building or to endow the funds that are needed for the building." So for today, I'm going to ask you to be a little bit patient about things that I'm going to suggest to you are preliminary steps, getting ready steps for a campaign. And then next time, we're going to go deep into actually how to organize and implement a campaign. And then there's a possibility, if there's enough interest, I think, to have a fourth program focusing in more detail on establishing a subsidiary not-for-profit organization. So we'll work with Susan and Melissa to talk about that if that's something that that we need to discuss. So then I just real briefly, does anybody have questions from the previous presentation that we had last week? Any questions that came up after you shut down your webinar that we can touch on? Because once we're through some of those preliminary questions, then I'll move to the PowerPoint and we'll get started on that presentation. Anything that came up while you were mulling over things after last time? Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started on today. And this is the PowerPoint, so we'll get that started. And again, we want to thank our sponsors and thank ATLM for their sponsoring this program. That's a good partnership, and I know that it's someone that's been useful for years and years, and I appreciate their support. Okay, so like I say, today we're going to get ready to secure funding resources. right? So there it is. We're mixing all these things together, and it's going to create a result that we hope will be positive for your organization. And just a reminder, I'm part of Sparrowhawk Consulting, worked with tribes since 1976. And I'm also adjunct faculty at the Evergreen State College, and there's contact information for you. And let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to talk about, which is, first off, we're going to talk about capacity building. And capacity building activities are a series of things you can do to make sure the organization is ready to fully engage and be successful in raising the funds. So that's an important part, and funders understand the term or the phrase capacity building. They understand what that means, and from their point of view, capacity building means creating a sustainable organization. All right. So when you hear capacity building, it can be things you're going to do within the organization to make the organization as strong as it can be and as competitive as it can be. But from the funder point of view, that says if those capacity building activities have been completed, then what's going to happen is this organization is likely to be a sustainable organization that will be able to take this building we're talking about and keep it operating and keep it running for years and years to come. So it's important to make that connection from the funder's point of view. We're also going to talk briefly about the idea of creating a portal that you can use to bring donations into your project. And so from that standpoint, there are some advantages and disadvantages of doing that. And like I say, if the group would like, we'll develop a fourth program around that topic, that second topic, and talk about it in more detail. And then the third part of this is organizing your team and looking at policies and procedures that will be part of getting ready again for a campaign. So the first thing we want to talk about is your network. And the questions we want to talk about are, what are your networking opportunities, right? What if you look around, within your community, and I know different groups have different size communities, different organizations that might be part of it. What are your networking opportunities? And if I'm saying, well, hey, I'm out here in Kyle, South Dakota, what are my networking opportunities? And what you want to do is not discount the possibility of networking opportunities that are in place. So for example, at Suquamish, with the Suquamish tribe, they had networking opportunities with a variety of the faith communities in that town. They had networking opportunities with a group called the Friends of Alala Neighbors. So that was a group that I think you remember last time we talked about the burning of the old man house. That group of people came up to be supportive of the tribe around that event and continued to operate in a supportive way. They were an important networking opportunity. Other groups within the community that had the tribe's best interest at heart were also people that could be part of your network. The more you establish, the more you increase your network, the better off you'll be. And it's not easy. I don't mean to suggest that it's easy, but it is an important step. I know I mentioned last time that Leonard Forsman, the chairman at Suquamish, were saying, I don't think there's going to be too many people that are going to want to support our building a longhouse or museum within this community. And frankly, he was very surprised. He was very surprised by the people, once they heard about what they're trying to do and why it was important to the tribe. There were some people that stepped up and said, yeah, we want to join and support you. And we'll talk more about that in a bit, because some of those folks also joined the foundation board, the tribal foundation board, and continued to support the fundraising activity at that point. And then how best to join? Well, the bottom line about volunteers, as many of you know, is you want to give people discrete tasks. If you ask somebody, hey, will you generally support our effort to build a cultural center on our reservation? That's kind of a broad ask. And people can say, yeah, I support you. But what works best, I think, is the idea of giving them discrete tasks. Could you come down on Saturday and help us do this, that, or the other thing from 11 until 2? And oh yeah, we are serving lunch. That's a good way to get volunteers involved because it has a clear start time and a clear stop time. And it gives them the ability to say, yep, I can take on that 4-hour, 3-hour, 4-hour time frame, and I'll help you make that happen. I mentioned last time the Port Gamble campaign had 100 volunteers, 100 volunteers. Half of those folks were non-native. The others were tribal members and other native people living on or near the reservation. So a big step up when it came to community support for that effort. And what are the costs and benefits? Well, yeah, there are costs and benefits. Obviously, the time that required to go out and recruit people to join the network and be a part of it. The care and feeding of those folks. At Port Gamble, we had quarterly meetings of the volunteers, and about half of them showed up every quarter and got information about the campaign, why it was important to the community. We also gave them sort of the first information, so they were on top of it. They knew before anybody else knew what was going on with that campaign, and that made them able to go out and tell the story effectively. So, yep, costs and benefits, and you have to put those into balance. But the more you can broaden your network, the better off you'll be when it comes to asking for support for the money needed to build the building. And money is not the only thing. For example, the longhouse at Port Gamble was built with logs harvested on that reservation. And one of the volunteers actually harvested those logs on behalf of the tribe, and that was his donation. That was how he gave to the campaign. He gave a gift of his logging services. And of course, that had a lot of value. So in the cost-benefit analysis, sometimes these folks who may not sit on your campaign committee or be part of your foundation board, they can donate, right? They can donate in the way that's comfortable for them. And the last thing, of course, I'm always big on action plans. Who's going to do what by when? So rather than just having a to-do list, making sure that you're identifying in this networking activity, who's going to do these steps? Who's going to go call on that logger to see if he'll donate his logging services? And when will that happen? By when will that happen? So you can hold people accountable for what they said they'd be willing to do to help you. So that's one thing I think it would be a helpful thing to think about. And then the thing we talked about, this whole idea of considering a tribal foundation. Now, I know that at least one of you from the one from Port Gamble already has a tribal foundation, and you might be able to tell us some of the things that you're aware of when it comes to that foundation. But the thing about a tribal foundation is we recommend that it be tribally chartered, right? It's IRS approved, and it serves as what I've said, this nonprofit portal that takes resources from primarily the private sector, Gates Foundation, Bush Foundation, others that might put money into your project. It takes it, and those dollars, those resources are received by this tribal foundation. The four that we created or helped create were the Port Gamble S'Klallam Foundation, the Tulalip Foundation, the Suquamish Foundation, and the Colville Foundation. We helped create those four tribal foundations. And I want to go back to tribally chartered because that's really an important factor for us. What that says is the tribe is using its sovereignty to create a nonprofit corporation, right? It's not going to the state of Washington or Oklahoma or what have you and asking that state to empower this organization, this foundation. It's using the inherent power inside the tribe to create this foundation. And again, we'll touch on that in more detail. And then IRS approved. So what we're talking about is creating a nonprofit corporation through the tribe. And some tribes will have a business code that you can use the business code to create that corporation. Some tribes don't have a business code, but in the case of the Suquamish Foundation, we used Article 3 of their constitution as a basis for establishing the Suquamish Foundation as a nonprofit corporation. Then we took that information, that nonprofit corporation, to the Internal Revenue Service and made it tax exempt, made it able to receive tax deductible donations. So that tribally chartered, using sovereignty is really important, at least from my point of view. And so, yeah, you could use 7871. Are some of you familiar with 7871? That section of the Internal Revenue Code says that the tribe, as much as a state or a city, can receive charitable gifts without a foundation, right? Because the law says they're treated as if they are a not-for-profit. So arguably, you could not even set up a foundation. You could just say to the Gates Foundation or whoever, hey, write a check to the Port Gamble S'Klallam tribe, and it'll be a charitable gift. The problem with that is, and I'll touch on this in a brief moment, is some of these organizations aren't comfortable writing a check to the tribe. They want to write a check to a nonprofit tax-exempt group. So the choices you've got are tribally chartered corporation, incorporated by the state government, or in some cases you can incorporate in the District of Columbia. That means that the District of Columbia is kind of, in a sense, kind of neutral ground when it comes to a government agency that can incorporate you. Okay. Just checking chat, make sure I'm not missing any questions. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of establishing this tribal foundation, right? Advantages, it allows additional focus on resource development. This is a group whose pretty much their sole purpose is raising resources for your project or other project. It makes some tribal projects eligible for support that wouldn't otherwise be available. So, we found that's a big difference. In a lot of cases, if a tribe was trying to apply for funding from the source, the tribe wouldn't be eligible, but the tribe's foundation would be eligible to apply to that particular source. Extra people power, yeah, your foundation board is going to bring more people to bear to help you. And when it comes to people power, it's really important to realize that people power can make a big difference. Let me give you a quick example. At Port Gamble, their foundation applied to a group called the Norcliffe Foundation, and they got a grant for their project of $10,000. Well, we added a couple more board members in the interim, and one woman who joined the foundation board went back to the Norcliffe Foundation and asked for a second gift. And you know what they gave beyond that $10,000? They gave an additional $150,000 to that campaign, a second gift of $150,000 on top of their $10,000 gift, in large part because that woman that we added to the board of the foundation had that kind of a network and was able to convince that foundation to consider a second, much, much larger gift. So it could be a very powerful thing. And then overcoming resistance to giving to the tribe. Hey, the tribe has its casino. We don't want to give to the tribe. Well, guess what? The Suquamish Foundation was able to get $7 million of giving to its foundation, despite the fact that the casino at Suquamish went from $70 million to $100 million in 2 years. So it can be a very powerful tool to overcome resistance to giving to the tribe. The disadvantages, honestly, it does take some extra time, staff time, in the care and feeding of the board, its agenda, its meetings, all that. And what typically happens is the tribe will donate a staff member part-time to be that staff person. Yep, you're going to have to establish a charter and fill out the forms and do all that paperwork. That's a disadvantage. It requires a separate accounting system, and of course the reports that come out of that accounting system, including the reports to the IRS. But here again, the contract between the Suquamish Foundation and the Suquamish tribe said the tribe will provide the accounting and the part-time staff to keep the organization going. At Port Gamble, I'm especially proud of Port Gamble because they really, that foundation has really blossomed. in a big, big way. So yeah, tribal nonprofits create an additional way to secure gifts and grants. Some funders will not give funds unless you have that tax-exempt 501c3 status. And again, very important that these tribally chartered not-for-profits support sovereignty and self-determination. Those are factors that, in my view, are really important. They're really important. And the big question then becomes, who is going to be the applicant, right? Will the tribe apply? Will this tribal foundation apply? Who's going to be the applicant? Will another organization that wants to support the effort be the applicant? In that case, strategically, you have to identify who is going to be the best applicant. For federal grants, for block grants, for example, it makes a lot of sense that the tribe is the applicant. It's the one that's clearly the one eligible to apply for a ICDBG grant. But when it comes to an application to the Bush Foundation or the Lannan Foundation or some of these others that might be interested, sometimes this nonprofit tax-exempt foundation might be the best applicant. And just stepping back for a moment, when you do submit a grant application to one of these groups, it's not uncommon, especially with private sector grant writing, to include both, right? If you're going to introduce the foundation as the applicant, but you're going to talk about that relationship that the foundation has with the tribe, that includes the accounting services, that includes the experience the tribe has had with grants for decades and decades in the past, that will be a benefit to the foundation based on that relationship between the tribe and its foundation. So it can work out really nicely from that standpoint. Okay, so let me just check in. Any questions up to this point? Any questions you'd like to pose? Give you a minute to look at that. Check the chat box. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, does the Tribal Foundation qualify for ICDBG? No, that would be an instance where you want to use the tribe as the applicant. But having said that, there are more and more federal grants where nonprofits can apply, where the Tribal Foundation could apply. And of course, the other thing is, since the Bush administration and including the Obama and Trump administrations, faith communities can also apply for federal grants in ways that they hadn't been able to do so in the past. So if you go, I don't know if you're familiar with, but if you're looking at that, if you go to grants.gov, right, and you put in nonprofit applicants, it will show you all the grants that are available to not-for-profit organizations, and that's how you'd find federal grants where the Tribal Foundation could apply. Thank you for that question. Okay, so I want to shift over to some other things to think about when it comes to capacity building. And when you identify who your applicant is, then the questions are, does this applicant have a reflective and representative board of directors, right? And that really applies mostly to your foundation. Obviously, your tribal council, your business committee is assumed to be reflective and representative because they've been elected, right, to serve in that capacity. So that's not so much an issue. But it is something to consider if you're looking at that at a foundation, a nonprofit organization. The capacity to raise funds from a variety of sources. Can this group get past special events, for example, or other ways of raising money? And I think I mentioned last time that the Longhouse at Suquamish had the benefit of a $1 million earmark from the legislature in Washington. That is, the House and Senate of Washington appropriated $1 million toward an $8 million price tag for the Longhouse facility there at Suquamish. Talk about diversity of funding sources, right? Yes, Gates put in $500,000, but the state of Washington put in $1 million toward that Longhouse. And a bunch of other private sector funders also put money in. It was also the Longhouse at Port Gamble did get block grant funds. Was able to get $500,000 of block grant for their Longhouse. So The ability to raise funds from a variety of sources, all very important. Cooperation and collaboration with other organizations and agencies, right? I think we all understand what that looks like, but it means that the people who are spearheading this effort to raise the funds are able and willing to get out and think about who else might support this, who else might give us a hand. And that means recruiting volunteers, looking at kindred organizations that might support you, and making those connections. And then support at the community level. The statement I often like to make is you can't come to a funder with an empty plate, right? You come to them and say, we have this really cool idea for a cultural center and we'd like you to fund it. And the question the funder is going to ask you is, what does the community put in toward this community center? Oh, we don't really have any money. We just thought you'd like to put some money in to help us build this. That's not a very winning approach. If you said, hey, we've been having fry bread sales for the last 6 weeks, and we've raised $10,000 toward this overall, that's a much stronger case, because in that case the community has bought those fry bread, Indian tacos, whatever it might be. They've made their statement that this is important, even if it's just $5 for an Indian taco. But having some resources from the community, really an important part of this. And then a key thing that we all know about is, how will you sustain the project? You built the cultural center, you built the museum. Where's the money going to come from to keep the operations and maintenance dollars in place? Where are those coming from? And fortunately at Suquamish, the tribal council made the decision to commit to funding the cost of the museum forever. That was a very competitive thing for that council to make that clear choice that no, this is important to us, and we will fund operations and maintenance above and beyond what the gate receipts will provide, above and beyond whatever grants they might receive. We'll make up the difference forever. That's a big commitment on their part. But these are the things that funders look at that you'll want to kind of keep in mind when it comes time to going out and asking for resources. And so part of this has to do with board development. And what I'm going to do here is kind of assume that you've got a board or you've made the decision that you'd like to create a board that would help support your project. And board development is really important because it gives you the ability to kind of take a look at, if you're going to create a board from whole cloth, right, add people to the board directly, you still want to be thinking about some of these things. For example, if you've got a current board in place, you want to look at their strengths and weaknesses. You want to be sure that you're recruiting a diverse and reflective board. And for some of us, we're thinking about that. It's like, wait a minute, they're going to tell us who should be on our board? No, not exactly. What they're really saying is they want a diverse board that's reflective of the community that's being served, right? A board that's diverse. And I'll give you an example. I worked with a group out this way that had 6 white male Methodist, Kiwanian, retired engineers, all living in the same county. Okay, 6 white male Methodist, Kiwanian, retired engineers, all living in the same county for an organization that was meant to serve 3 counties. Now, please take into consideration, there's nothing wrong with any of those characteristics, nothing wrong with being male or Methodist or Kiwanian or what have you, but you can imagine what's happening here in terms of their perspective, right? They're so homogeneous that they're not going to have any diverse points of view. They're not going to have representatives from the other counties that they serve. They're going to be pretty, they're going to have their blinders on. And they knew that. They understood that they were, they had basically recruited board members from the groups they were already all a part of. So we started working with them to try to help diversify that board. And I'll talk about that process in a minute. The problem was about 6 months later, this organization went out of business. It went out of business in part because it didn't have the broad base of community support that it needed to survive. And so that's why this whole idea of a diverse and reflective board is really so important. Another key element here is that board education and training for, to make sure that they're aware of their responsibilities. And that should be something you do on a quarterly basis. Giving them a quarterly program that kind of helps them understand, what their job is and what the organization is doing to advance the welfare of the community. And then an annual board assessment, self-assessment process. At the end of each year, just ask the board to sit down and do a self-assessment to determine, ways that they might improve the work of the board going forward. And in your packet of material from Melissa and Susan, there is a brief board recruitment tool that you could use to help you sort of think about how that might work. So the steps I might suggest to you are be clear about the characteristics that make up your community. Who's part of your community? And of course, in a tribal setting, you've got both the tribal members, the families themselves, other native people living on or near the reservation, non-native people on or near the reservation, a number of different people, groups that make up that capital C community. Then taking a look at your current board in light of those community constituencies. Are all the constituencies of your community reflected in your board? And yeah, the Suquamish Board of Directors, the Port Gamble Board, had a minority of non-native or other native people. Of course, the controlling board members were tribal members or members of the council or business committee. So you maintain control of your nonprofit, but you do have non-natives and other native people living on or near the community be a part of that. You can look at things like the gender of the people, the age, their work, professions, the skills, associations, and hobbies. Those are all things you would look at to determine how broad or how diverse your board might be. And with that in mind, looking for balanced representation, you have a variety of professions represented on your board. It's always a good idea, for example, to have somebody who has financial oversight background, because those people can help you with that important board role of financial oversight. So a CPA from a firm nearby, or somebody with bookkeeping experience might be somebody that you, from a professional standpoint, you would want to add. People with insurance backgrounds, people with banking backgrounds, people with architectural engineering backgrounds, lots of different professions that might be involved. And then a diversity of skills and a range of other affiliations and interests. Why do I have associations and hobbies on this grid or on this matrix? Well, because people who are part of a reading club or a biking club, or people that are part of a service club in your community, each of them bring a network that can expand your network. And so if you bring somebody, for example, who's a Rotarian or a member of the Lions Club or what have you, if they're willing to join your group, then they might be a good addition. And I'm not suggesting just bringing people in because they're part of a service club. I'm saying, of course, you want to vet each person. But if they truly believe that this is something they want to support, they can be invaluable when it comes to adding their network to your network and increasing the resources that you can bring for your project. Another thing I want to talk about beyond the board development is strategic planning. And I know when you hear a consultant talk about strategic planning, you're going, oh boy, here we go. This is the consultant speak facet of this program, right? You got to have strategic planning. But let me tell you a story for a tribal client that I had. They submitted a grant to a funder, and the funder came back and rejected the grant. And we didn't, my company didn't write the grant, but we were asked by the client to check with the funder and determine why was it not funded. Because from the tribe's point of view, from the tribal foundation's point of view, all the T's were crossed, all the I's were dotted. It was a good grant, and they were right. It was a good grant. So they asked me to contact the funder to find out why it didn't get funded. So I called up Marie and I said, Maria, I'm looking to find out more information. The Tribe Foundation would like to know how they can improve their applications in the future. And so uh, she was willing to talk with me and kind of give me their perspective. They said, you know what? We looked at the tribal foundation's strategic plan, and we saw the direction that that plan said the foundation was going and the tribe was going. We looked at the grant, and there was a disconnect between the two. It looked like they were going in a different direction. So the grant was taking the group in one direction, and the strategic plan was taking them in another direction. And I think what happened was the strategic plan had not been updated recently. And so it was kind of stale. And that's what caused that disconnect to happen. The point is that it was not because the grant wasn't well written. It was well written. The problem was this disconnect between their strategic plan and the direction this grant wanted them to go. So this planning process is pretty straightforward. An environmental assessment that you provide to the planners, giving them the information that will help them determine what direction the group should go. And the good news is that that environmental assessment can in large part be drawn from the community assessment that we talked about last time. So if you've done the work around the community assessment, the surveys, the focus groups, the individual interviews, some of the secondary research you can get from the census and other sources, that information can be put into an environmental assessment and made accessible to your planners, to whoever will be part of that planning team. That's a powerful way to make sure that the plan that's developed by the planning team is not focused so much on backyard issues, but on broader issues that the community at large is facing. And of course, the next piece, for those of you who have been through this process, you know that SWOT means strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So you do that kind of assessment. You ask your group, your planning group, either in small groups or a large group, to determine what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats that this organization and this community is facing. That becomes the basis of your planning. And what you want to be sure to do is make sure that the plan you develop, your strategic plan that you develop, builds on the strengths and the opportunities of the organization and addresses the weaknesses and threats, right? So when everything's all said and done, you look back at the plan you've developed and you determine that, yeah, this is, we're going to be effective in addressing the SWOT. So let's take a look just to kind of give you a sample, look at an environmental assessment report that was done for a tribal group. Okay, I'm going to move over to this one. So this is an example of an environmental assessment that the Suquamish Foundation used for their planning purposes. And you have this in your packet, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through it all. But what I want to make sure you're aware of is this is a really extensive, this is a 13-page document that was given to the foundation board before the planning process started to ensure that they had all the information that they needed to be effective in being the plan. So you'll notice for the economic demographic and social trends, both in the United States and in the Washington state, you'll notice breakout of the population characteristics, the economy of the state. Again, these are all pretty broad, overreaching things, but as we move through this document, wage and salary, employment levels, all within the time frame that they were looking at, the percent of family by household type, really, really detailed information about the population in Washington. But as we move through this, state-supported childcare opportunities, juvenile arrest and rehabilitation, language spoken at home, right? Very important there. And then we got down to the county, the county, the tribe and its neighbors. So looking at the Port Madison Indian Reservation, which is the home of the tribe, the adjacent reservation at Port Gamble, the Skokomish Reservation was another reservation nearby, all the characteristics that we could share with them. about each of these population. Almost all this was drawn from the census, right? Household income, estimated values, all of these things became part of the report that they had before they started the planning process. And here's all the sources that we used. So again, you've got a copy of this sample environmental assessment in your packet, and you're welcome, of course, to use it however you choose. Let's get back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so of course the key elements of any strategic plan are the mission, which asks, what do we do? And you're not going to find, I don't think you're going to find a grant that won't ask you for what the mission of your organization is. I challenge you to find me a grant, current grant requirements that don't include the mission statement. And basically all that asks is, what do we do? And I'll give you a couple examples. The vision says, what will we become in the future? Looking forward, what will we become in the future? The values, cardinal value statements, and oftentimes those include respect for our elders, collaboration and integrity. Cardinal values, goals are not so much goal like a goal to build the new building. The goal are organizational goals, which to increase the awareness of our organization in the communities that we serve. And then of course the objectives and action plans that lay out how you're going to measure whether you've effectively carried out your goals, and the action plans, which we'll talk about in more detail in a moment. So this guy said, simply put, strategic planning determines where an organization is going over the next year or more, how it's going to get there, and how it'll know if it got there or not. That's exactly what I'm trying to emphasize, right? Where are you going as an organization? And the advantages of strategic planning is it creates direction and cohesion among the council or the board members and others. So you have oneness of mind when it comes to where you're going as an organization. It also allows you to effectively communicate the needs with your potential donors and funders, right? Because you've created the strategic planning process. That plan becomes a part of the case you're going to make for raising the money to build your cultural center. And last, it's also a basis for current and future success, right? Where are you going to go and how will you know you got there? So let's take a look at some examples. And I'll skip past this. I've talked about this enough, I think. Okay, so here's an example from the Osage Nation Museum. Oops. I got to go back here. Yeah, there's the example, sorry. Okay, the mission is to foster the education of the public about the history, culture, and artistic expressions of the Osage people. So that's the mission of that Osage Nation Museum. And you notice I put in brackets by preserving and developing collections, et cetera, et cetera. In my mind, that's not the mission. That's the purpose statement or an indication of how they'll carry out the mission. My feeling is that a mission statement should be something you can memorize and your board can memorize, not something you have to go pull out of a folder. Oh, what's your mission statement? Let me pull that out of the file folder. Or it's up on the wall and it's about a paragraph long. That's too long. It should be something that you and your board can memorize and share with a funder if they ask you. So mission, what do we do? Vision. Vision tells us how we see the future of our organization and those we serve. So looking forward, right? Here's a vision statement from the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture in Santa Fe. And you can see a world that recognizes and understands Native peoples as diverse tribes, each with a distinctive history, culture, and language, and each of which is an integral part of a vibrant historical and cultural landscape of the American Southwest. That's their vision statement. That's the world they want to see if their vision was carried out. So you've got that as an example for vision. And in this case, I offered a couple other kind of analogous examples. If you had a food bank, we would say we envision ourselves as the premier food bank in the inland Northwest. So we not, sorry, we may not be the premier food bank in that area, but that's how we want to become. We want to be the premier food bank. And we envision our region free of hunger. That is for their clients, that if they carry out their mission of providing food to their clients, eventually they will end hunger in that region. That's the vision for their clients. And when it comes to values, so we value a collaborative approach to getting our work accomplished. We value regular feedback from our supervisors and coworkers, are just examples of values that you might consider. And then goals. Again, goals in this way of thinking are not, our goal is to build the new building, but instead, here's a work, this is a goal from one of our tribal clients. I need to move this box, there we go. So it says, work in collaboration with the Longhouse Library Committee to build a new building by 2020, in this case, 2012, right? But their goal says provide a culturally appropriate environment to support education and employment services to tribal and community members. And you may be able to guess what this goal was for. Well, this was the career and education building goal, right, from their strategic plan. So working with, the objective was to have that building built by, in this case, I think 2012. So setting goals like this, a culturally appropriate environment to support education and employment services, that's their aim, their overall aim or aspiration for their project and for their organization. Objectives are supposed to be measurable to increase, so for example, to increase our name recognition from its current 7% to 15% in year one of the plan. That can be a big deal. To increase the number of positive media mentions by 25% in each of 3 years. That's going out and telling the story of your foundation or of your tribal organization in a way that more people will be aware of that organization and how it's advancing the community. And I'll give you a quick story about that. A group in Portland, Oregon wanted to raise a large amount of money to build a freestanding children's hospital in Portland, Oregon. They had a 7% recognition rate, right? 7% of the adults in Oregon knew about that hospital, and they wanted to raise $35 million. Well, they knew with a 7% recognition rate, they were not going to be able to raise $35 million. So the board said, we're going to have a goal of increased awareness and appreciation of our hospital in the state of Oregon. And our objective is to go from 7% to 70% recognition rate in 10 years. 10 years later, they had a 72.5% recognition rate, and they raised $50 million in 18 months. And the newspapers were, hey, look at this, it's amazing. Gee, they raised $50 million in 18 months. That's just amazing. But they didn't realize that they'd spent 10 years, right? They had 10 years to raise awareness of that organization in an effort to raise that money. And that's really the strength, that's the power, right, of using this kind of planning process, because they realized with a 7% recognition rate, they were not going to be successful raising that kind of money. Oh, okay. We had a question about why the goal had 2 bullet statements above it. Those were other examples of goal statements, and I just focused on the one from the tribal example. So those just are the other goal statements that you might consider as examples. Thanks for that. Yeah, another question. What is the best way to identify recognition rate? And that's kind of depends on how broad you want to do that. Most of the time that's done by survey. And the good news is you don't have to survey everybody in your community to determine that rate. For example, The Lou Harris poll or the Gallup poll, are you familiar with those two? Those are national polls. They're designed to survey the points of view or the attitudes of over 300 million people. How many people do they survey? How many households do they survey to identify the points of view, the opinions of 333 million people? Well, I'll just tell you, 1,400 households. So what you do is you set up, you basically set it up so you randomly select households within the reservation, for example, or within that community, or whichever community you want to identify recognition rates for, and you send out a survey of just a small subset of that group. But the kicker, the trick, is making sure that you're selecting households using random numbers. Basically randomly selected households. So, for example, I had a client, and for some reason they wanted to survey 2,000 households. I hired a company north of us to basically do that survey for us, and they went through the names and addresses that were in their database, and they picked out 2,000 randomly selected households, and we went through and we were able to get that kind of information from those households. The other way, like with Puyallup, they wanted us to survey every tribal member, and that was 2,953 members. So we literally sent out those surveys to all tribal members and gave them the ability to respond in hard copy by mailing it back or by SurveyMonkey to create that kind of information. It's a very powerful tool, and I know it sounds like work. There's no doubt about it, that sounds like work, but you don't have to survey everybody in the community. You can pick just on a random basis people within the community, and they'll give you a pretty good idea of what your recognition rate might be. And then, of course, the old action plans. What do those include? They include the strategy you're going to follow. You're going to identify the timeline. When is that strategy going to be completed? The participants, who's going to carry out that strategy? The resources that are available to you. And that's a tricky part, because it says, don't just skip over, hey, we've got nothing. We got nothing to work on. We got no resources. We're going to have to get all the resources we need from somebody else. That's not the best approach, because almost invariably, tribal foundations have resources. Again, back to the Port Gamble example, the infrastructure of that longhouse was built with logs harvested on that reservation. So that would be a resource available. And then, of course, what are the resources that are needed to carry out each of those strategies as part of your action plan? And then any notes you want to include about that action plan. Again, the hierarchy is, what are the goals? Then what are the objectives for each of the goals? And then what are the action plans to carry out those objectives? How are we going to accomplish those objectives? And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about the action plans. Okay, so shifting over for a moment, who should be on your financial development team? Who should be the players that you want to bring into this process? Oops, looks like I did it again, sorry. I'm I'm brave enough to suggest that the tribal chairperson should be part of this team. And we've been very fortunate in having the tribal chairpersons of each of our clients be actively involved. It's important to have that leader step up and say, yeah, hey, I'm going to be part of this. And whether it was Ron Charles at Port Gamble or Leonard Forsman at Suquamish, the executive director at Squaxin, each of them stepped up and said, yeah, I'm part of this. I'm going to tell the community and these funders and the broader community, based on my presence, based on my involvement, that this is important to us. And of course, the tribal elders are also people that should be included in as part of this. They bring tremendous wisdom and experience that can be very useful. And you'll be surprised how a number of the elders have experience that perhaps you don't even know about, where over the course of their lives, they have gone out and raised resources for a variety of projects. Other council representatives, of course, if that's possible, to bring those folks in. Your foundation, if you decide to go with the foundation, those board members are essential. They're the real drivers when it comes to this kind of fundraising activity. Your chief financial officer, your CFO or the tribal CFO or designee, is also important because they're going to be the ones that are going to help manage the money, whether it comes to the tribe or the foundation. They're the ones that are going to provide you the accounting statements that go to your foundation board meetings. They're an essential part of this. And then, of course, your community development department representatives should be part of this. Community development at Suquamish were key parts of our team because they're, I mean, if you're going to be building buildings on the res, the community development folks have something to say about how that goes and how they're going to be integrated into that process as you begin construction and before you begin construction, of course, site prep, all that. And I'll tell you a little story about Port Gamble. When we decided to build the longhouse, it was being built on land that everybody assumed was vacant. There was nothing there. But we started to dig, the project started to dig, and they found infrastructure. They found conduit. They found things that that nobody knew was there. So having the community development department be a part of that process and have them help us work out, looking back at the old drawings and old sketches and finding out, hey, you can't put the longhouse quite there. You're going to have to move the building so it doesn't come on top of infrastructure. And of course, the planning department is a really important part because oftentimes they all are also the group that does the grant writing. So I want to be sure they're involved. And of course, sometimes tribal groups blend together community development and planning. Squaxin, for example, is the community development and planning department integrated into a single department. And other volunteers, people that can do the GIS work, other people that can come in and donate their time as their way of contributing to the campaign. Yeah, we're just going to get started on this. We're going to talk a lot more about this next time. But for now, these are the 3 Ps of campaign infrastructure: policies and procedures, people pulling together, and publications. You got to have all 3, right? So policies and procedures basically define how you're going to run a campaign, how you're going to go forward with a campaign. It's kind of the rules of the road when it comes to your campaign. The people, there are a lot of different people that need to be brought into a campaign. One of the groups of people that you might not think about are honorary chairs. Who will be the honorary chair of your campaign? These are people, the honorary chairs are not people that, are necessarily real active in the day-to-day and month-to-month campaigning, but they lend their name and their connections to your campaign. So for example, with a campaign for an environmental learning center, we had Barbara Kingsolver, who is a pretty well-known environmental author who served as one of the 3 honorary chairs. You're also going to have your campaign chairs, all your campaign committee members. It can be a pretty good sized organization to raise $1.5 million to $5 million, 10 million. Like I say, the Suquamish campaign was $19 million, 7 of which came from other organizations. And then the publications. These are the 3 things you'll want to pull together that are part and parcel of getting ready for a campaign. So what should be included in your campaign policies and procedures? Well, language about the foundation accounts and the campaign fund. Donors are going to want to know that the funds that are being raised for the cultural center are not being commingled with other funds. They're going to want to know that the funds are in a separate and distinct campaign fund. So that's part of what you share in the campaign policies and procedures. And keep in mind that the donors may ask to see your campaign policies and procedures as a way of reassuring them that these things are in place and that the tribe and or its foundation have agreed to these policies and procedures. Donation sources. Are you willing to accept donations from any source? Or do you want to put restrictions on the sources that can donate to your campaign? Some organizations, for example, prohibit donations from any organizations that manufacture, distribute, or sell alcoholic beverages. So they've said, we don't want any money from Anheuser-Busch or from any company that produces or distributes alcohol. That's one restriction that I've seen. But that's up to you. And the thing that's most important is you make those decisions early on. right? Because what you don't want to have happen is get a gift from an organization that the foundation board or the tribal council says, hey, we don't want that money. That money is not okay with us. Send that money back. That puts the word out to the funding groups that the group is not ready to raise money for their campaign. So get that taken care of, squared away early on. Donation types and processing. Are you willing to accept cash? Will you take credit cards for gifts that you receive? Will you take gifts of stock, or take bonds? Will you take real estate? Will you take art pieces? And how will those various kinds of gifts get processed? And it's not uncommon for people to decide that, yeah, we'll take a gift. You can charge your contribution on your credit card if you want airline points or whatever it might be. But what kind of donation types are you willing to accept? And then how do you accept gifts? What process will you go through to accept the gifts? Donor confidentiality. Of course, the obligation of any campaign is to protect the confidentiality and the identity of any donors, especially if they ask to be anonymous donors. And it's not uncommon for somebody who says, yeah, I'll donate, but I don't want anybody to know that I donated. And so I want you to I want you to label my gift as a gift from anonymous. Now that's okay. That's how it works. Donor acknowledgement. Are you going to have a donor wall? Are you going to have different levels of donation acknowledged in a different way, so that the higher donations are acknowledged with bigger letters on the donor wall? Or how will you organize the donor acknowledgement? And that's part of your policies and procedures. Ethical considerations. You want to be sure that you're not being overbearing, in terms of your volunteers going out and asking for a gift. They shouldn't be trying to be overbearing or pressure someone to make a gift that they're just not ready to make. So ethical considerations. And then professional advice. If somebody says to you, I need to talk to my CPA or my lawyer about this before I'm willing to make a gift, that's okay. And give them the time that they need to go out and talk with their advisor and see, okay, yeah, I've talked with my advisor, and she told me that I can afford to make a gift, and I'm ready to make a gift. Now, you have a copy of policies and procedures in your handouts, and given the time, I'm not going to take time to go through that document, but I basically took an outline from that document that's on this slide, so you'll have a clear idea of what exactly these topics mean. But if you go to the actual sample policies and procedures, you'll get more detail that you can use then as you think about your own campaign policies and procedures. Another topic we wanted to talk about is coordinating with other professionals. And that's really, really important. What I've got here for you is, this is a sketch. This is a really, really early sketch of the longhouse at Port Gamble. Okay, can you kind of see how it's organized? Right? It's all wrong. It's all wrong. Can you tell why it's wrong? Well, that roof line is wrong. For the Port Gamble people, they used a shed style. They didn't use a peaked roof style. Okay, and this architect kept bringing them peaked roof style longhouse. And finally, one of the grandmas said, Mr. Cutler, Port Gamble Sklallam people don't have peaked roof longhouses. We have shed style. We have shed style. And you need to go back and redesign this to reflect how we built our buildings. And so if you look at the second example here, the photograph, you'll see a shed style building, right, with the totems out front that reflected a coordination, a very clear coordination with the architect and with the tribal members. That's really, really important. You've got to be sure that whatever building is being built takes into account culturally appropriate design, other accommodations that make a big difference, make a huge difference, obviously. Does the facility face east and west? Does the facility face the water? Does all these things that are part and parcel, that some of these folks, even though they've had other experiences working with tribes, may not be aware of that particular tribe and its cultural imperatives. So coordinating with these folks, really, really important. The other thing you have to take into consideration, and we'll talk about this more next time, is you've got to take into consideration the money and the design and the construction, right? What we do is we set up a timetable of who we're going to apply to for the money, when that money might come in. So let's say it's a 2-year, 3-year campaign. We've set up a timetable about when that application is going to go to the Bush Foundation, when that application is going to go to the Gates Foundation, when that application is going to the Landon Foundation. When will they decide? When might they decide on whether they're going to give us a grant to move this building forward? Okay, so that's that timetable. Then on top of that timetable is the architectural timetable. If we're going to build this building, when do we need to engage that architect and hire them to do the design work? When will we have the money available to us to bring them on to do that design work? If we're going to move toward construction within this time frame, when will that money be available to begin the site prep? When will that money be available to begin construction? So those two timelines, the architectural engineering timeline and the fundraising timeline, have to intersect. They have to run in tandem as you move along on your project. And yeah, I'll be perfectly candid with you. That's our best guess. That's our best guess. There's no, for sure this is going to happen, but at the same time, you have to create that kind of synergy between your fundraising and your development, your building development. Okay, well, there you have it. Getting ready for raising money. And I hope this was a conversation that was useful. I'm going to stop my share and open it up in the time we have left for any questions that you might have.
All right, John.
Any questions at all? Hopefully that was useful to you.
All right, what kind of questions do we have?
Hi, this is Jessica Winstaffer with Chickaloo Native Village, and thank you, Dawn. That was thorough and a bit overwhelming, I have to say. Just no, I don't think it was bad. Just for me, the recognition of there's so much work to do for this, and I appreciate all of the details identifying all that work, so I don't go into it quite so naively. The last thing that you just spoke on was the timelines within the resources that you've provided. Are there examples of the different things we might want to consider for those timelines?
Sure, and that could be something that we make sure we include in next week's program. Yeah, that would be something we could add in, because I know we've done those for a number of clients. And just in terms of your comment regarding kind of, this is a little overwhelming, remember, the more of these things you do, you're heightening your possibility of success. So, is this a prescription? If you don't do one of these things, well, you're just not going to be successful. I can't say that, but what I can say, if you take on, this idea of a nonprofit portal, if you do the care and feeding, if you have the planning process in place, if you do all these things, you significantly improve your chances of being successful. So yeah, and bear in mind, I don't mean to be glib about this, but the Port Gamble campaign was a 4.5-year process. The $19 million Suquamish campaign was a 5.5-year process. So it's not something that happened overnight. It took the time to create these things. At the same time, the good news, creating a tribal foundation could literally happen in 6 to 8 weeks. If you have the support that you need to make that happen. So, and we'll talk about that. If you want to talk about the tribal foundation idea, I think there's interest in maybe having a session just focusing on that. And in that case, we'll give you articles and bylaws of other foundations. We'll give you a lot of information on how to create those organizations, how best to apply to the IRS to create, to get 501c tax exempt status. All that could be the focus of another webinar. What else? What other questions do you have?
Do you have a list of foundations that provide support for capital campaigns?
That yeah, we have certainly have those we know of that have provided support for a variety of organizations. Of course, that's somewhat regional, right? If you're in Minneapolis, St. Paul, then you're going to be looking at a different group of people than if you're in the Seattle area. So um, I guess our hope is that the techniques that we talked about in terms of identifying possible sources would be useful in making that more regional approach. But there are some that we can share that are fairly common on a more or less national basis that might be useful.
Thank you. That would be great. And also any advice you have on how they can research regional funding sources? You mentioned
Yeah.
a website last time. Are there others in addition to that one?
Yeah, on a state by state basis, if you want to get down to the kind of the nitty gritty of funders that are more or less, that may or may not be in the foundation directory online, either your attorney general or your secretary of state will have a list of what we call charitable trusts. And the charitable trusts are much more accessible than some of the bigger foundations because those are typically family-based organizations that make, and the trustee of that bank can make a decision to make a gift or a grant to your project. So even though if you went to Gates Foundation, it might take them 5 to 7 months to decide, I have literally gone to Heritage Bank in Olympia, talked to a trust officer who's managing a trust, and they cut the check that same afternoon. It was not a big gift.
Oh,
It was not a big gift, but they have the discretion of making a gift based on a simple presentation to that trust officer. That's the spectrum. That's the cut a check in the afternoon after you talk with them, to 6 to 9 months for the Murdoch Charitable Trust, or 5 to 7 months of consideration by the Gates Foundation. That's a pretty broad spectrum in terms of timing, and of course also in terms of how much they can afford to spend. But and that's something I can mention. We always say go to your most friendly funder first. And I'll give you a real quick example. We were trying to raise money for the Port Gamble Scholalum Library, Little Boston Library, and we had to raise $800,000 for that building. It's a 4,000 square foot library. Okay. Well, we got 35,000 from the Cheney Foundation, and that was it. That was the one grant we got. We needed 800,000. So we went to the Ferguson Foundation, the Hugh and Jane Ferguson Foundation out of Seattle, and we asked them for $7,500, $7,500. And we knew they were going to make that grant. We knew we were going to make that grant. So yep, they gave us $7,500 as a grant. The reason that $7,500 against $800,000, what's the big deal, right? The big deal is that little foundation is looked at in the Seattle metro area as the good housekeeping seal for other Seattle-based funders. And so when we were able to tell other potential grant makers that Ferguson had made a grant along with Cheney, that opened the door for others to come in and provide funding for us. So the rule of thumb is you always go to your most friendly funders first, despite the fact that they may not be able to give you a significant grant. All right, with that, I think we're kind of running out of time. I want to be respectful of your time. But again, I appreciate your attendance today. I hope it was useful. We have a question here. Should we have architectural plans done before we ask for money? Could it be a sketch? Real quick. The answer is you want more than a cocktail napkin, right? You want a sketch that's more than just on the back of a cocktail napkin. The more detail you can provide for your feasibility study, for example, I think we provided you a copy of what we call a test case statement. That's a 4-page full color document that we use to go out and test whether or not the campaign was feasible. If you go back to that example, you go back to that material in your handouts from last time, you'll see what that looks like. That's just what's called a test case statement. And included in that test case statement will be some sketches that the architects gave us. And even those sketches can kind of be a little bit pricey, but the more you can show the donor what it likely will look like, it doesn't have to be the exact. We're not talking blueprints here. We're talking about conceptual sketches that help prospective donors go, yeah, you know where it's going to be. You have the land. You know what it's roughly what it's going to look like. That's enough to help make the campaign move forward, because there are two rules. Is it reasonable? Is this project reasonable? And two, is it doable? Those are the things that funders want to know. Is it reasonable? Are you building a 27,000 square foot longhouse? That may not be thought of as reasonable, right? Or, based on your community size. Oh, is it doable? Yeah, we've already raised $10,000 from the community to help move this project forward. That helps make it reasonable. All right. Well, again, thank you for your time. I appreciate the chance to talk with you again. I look forward to seeing you next week. We'll be talking about campaign logistics, actually carrying out a campaign. And then we'll talk some more about whether you want to go forward with any kind of presentation on tribal foundations down the road. All right.
Great.
Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Don.
Thank you, Don. You're wonderful.
Bye-bye. Oh,
Bye.
thank you.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye-bye now.